what I would argue is that whiteness is, of course, a fantasy, and what you have in relation to the object A is really the constitution of subjectivity and identity. It is the object A that allows you to define your identity. So the sort of movement of the drive that Lacan describes is a circular movement where the energy of the drive shoots out of the subject, circles the external object, and then re-enters into the subject. So there's something about the external world that facilitates the constitution of whiteness. So their identity in trekking through the road, through the streets, is dependent upon certain social structures. Their very subjectivity is dependent upon it. And we see this perhaps more starkly in times of slavery, where you had slave masters who would become white based upon their ability to hold slaves. Holding slaves was proof not only that you are a member of a superior class, but also that you are somehow, more human, better than other whites, not just better than blacks, right? Better than other whites. Holding slaves, having slaves, allowed you a certain social status. And so there, you literally have the figure of the object A. You have the fantasy object as slave, as your possession.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And quite literally also. And so then there's that kind of hierarchy of who really has, you have this funny hierarchy then is created of the lower, higher whites in that spectrum,
right?
Who really, anyway,
yeah. So you rise in class by having more slaves,
but you don't actually have the object A. Yeah?
Of course not. Of course not. But what you have is a symbolic that reinforces your imaginary fantasies. That's really what you have. That's what whiteness is all about. That's the power of whiteness. It's the ability to project your imaginary into the social and have it reaffirmed.
I think this is one way we could see this in terms of how fantasy itself is structured. Because it's structured, but along with its structure for this complete jouissance, it also stages castration. Yeah. So that's already inbuilt into it, that it's going to self-destruct. Mm-hmm. And what you do with that self-destruction, again, you find an object to externalize. Yeah.
Right. Whiteness has its own built-in contradictions because it assumes a supreme humanness that can never be achieved.
Absolutely.
There was something else I wanted to bring up with you because you raised it. You deployed the concept of the real in a very interesting way that I think might be difficult for some audience who are not really familiar with Lacanian thinking, but it's really, I feel, very important to what you're driving at, which is you were driving at that you're really arguing that it's an agency outside of language, to really think of it not so much as just the impossible, but sometimes you see it argued that way, but to think of it really as an agency of language, which is quite a little bit Hegelian, actually, way of thinking about how it operates, because we usually in Lacanian texts, at least my familiarity, it's not quite brought to that level of thinking of the real as agency, because that means it has an action of operation. We can, in retrospect, assign that, but in phenomenological experience, when we're talking about the real, it's often described as more of as I said, an impossible that we can't account for, that we kind of make a projected. Yeah, I'm sorry.
I think if you think, I'm not a clinician, but if you think more clinically, jouissance is tied to the insistence of certain forms of pleasure. And that's what racism is about too. It's, to get back to what Derek was saying about, telling me what to desire. Racism is a mode of jouissance. It's a mode of enjoyment that we learn and we become habituated to. And so it's for this reason that I think of racism in relation to the drive, which does have this insistent energy, this insistence on coming back. Lacan says, the real is the impossible, but it's also the thing that always keeps on coming back. The real is what comes back to the same place. And so it does have that force of movement. And indeed, what I argue in the chapter is that racism is an unconscious form of enjoyment. It comes from a structuring of the psyche around modes of enjoyment that are socially determined and then get repeated by the subject. And so from that perspective, you can think of racism as what Lacan calls an interdit, or a sort of slip of the tongue. It's the unconscious speaking. We gain unconscious pleasure from
It's very
racism.
interesting. It's also, for many people listening, they might not quite grasp that when Lacanians, I'm maybe be a little bit rough here, when Lacanians are talking about the unconscious, we're not idealizing the unconscious. The unconscious is a mechanism or a system that is not like some romantic, beautiful thing that we just, has all the wonderful answers if we only just find a way to tap into it. It's rather a different situation filled with a lot of nonsense. So it's not exactly romanticized in any way, shape, or form. I wanted to now, I think we should move to taking questions from people at 2:00. But I have still myself some other things that I would love to hear a little bit more. You mentioned in your essay as well. Well, there's quite a lot to go on, but you mentioned the Lacan's in seminar on ethics. He talks about the crucifixion in particularly and how that works. I thought it was very interesting the way that you explored that, the ate concept.
Yes.
Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit for us, because it's very interesting how that relates to what you're talking about. It's a little different than the object. It's a kind of sort of fixed image thing, almost, the way I understood it.
Yeah, so the object A is the fantasy object that we're trying to pursue. The ate is something that Lacan says has raised to the level of the thing. So the thing is like, the final object that can make me whole, right? So the object A is like a fantasy object. It's more intangible, but the thing is like the thing. It's like, that's it. There's nothing else, right? That's the thing that I want. And the way that Lacan talks about this is through a religious context. He suggests that we could think of God as sort of positioned as the thing. And then Jesus Christ and the image of the crucifixion stands as both a barrier and a lure toward the thing. So Jesus Christ is the ate, right? And the term ate comes from the Greek word atrocious. So the crucifixion is this atrocity that both draws us toward God and protects us from collapsing with the beyond. And my argument is that in some ways, race functions as ate. Race promises us access to the beyond. And the racialized figure simultaneously could be seen as the thing that's preventing me from achieving complete satisfaction. Why am I not happy? It's because the Mexicans are taking my job, right? So the racial other is both the barrier and the attraction that tells us there is this beyond, there is this ultimate satisfaction, this incomparable bliss that I can achieve. So there's a way in which race functions to fuel the fundamental fantasy of the subject, the fantasy that lack can be filled. And one of the things that I do in the chapter is talk about how lynching also gets tied into that, and how the lynch victim sort of stands as ate. But I also make the final argument that in a way, race is the ate for psychoanalysis. That is, race is the barrier that psychoanalysis itself has not gone past. Because what you do in the clinic is you actually try to go to the thing, at least temporarily. Whereas in the social sphere, it's not necessarily something you want to do. It's something that fuels racism. But in a clinical context, clearly race is something that we want to theorize and understand. So we want to go beyond the ate to the level of the thing. The thing, of course, is synonymous with Lacan's concept of the real.
Right.